Naoki Urasawa is back. Yes, Pluto is finally here. The anime adaptation of Pluto has just hit Netflix. All 8 episodes, an hour long each. We're talking pretty much the length of a 20-episode anime series. That's how long the show is. And my gosh, came into the show with, honestly, a lot of expectations. Early on, I did not know that this was done by the creator of Monster, so that expectation was not there. Well, let's be perfectly honest. Masao Maruyama, the producer behind Monster and a lot of Satoshi Kon stuff, pretty much made a lot of very controversial statements about the anime industry. And so, obviously, with him throwing shade during the time this is being produced, he's got to make sure this show is going to come out swinging. And honestly, after watching these 8 episodes, I'm very impressed with the series. But yes, after watching all 8 episodes done by Studio M2, this is my full review of the series, so let's just jump right into it. The manga Pluto is loosely based off of Tezuka's Astro Boy. So there's a lot of similarity here in names and whatnot. I mean, we have Adam, Astro Boy, in the actual show. But this show follows a robot detective named Geshik, and Geshik works for Europol. At the time this show is opening up, we have this murder that happens of this one robot that was involved in the 39th Asian War. His name was Mont Blanc, and he was actually very popular because following the war, he pretty much became a celebrity because he was doing a lot of things for conservationist type of stuff, working for a lot of parks and whatnot. But this death isn't the first, as we see like a string of murders that all happen that all have a similar call sign to each one of them. At the head of the corpse, they always find something protruding that looks like horns. And as Geshik looks into this, he starts to find a deeper plot line that eventually lead him to believe that essentially these specialized robots that took place during this Asian war are all being killed one by one. And so that kind of gives them an idea of who their next target is for the serial murders, but at the same time, seems like whoever this is extremely powerful. Eventually, we get this deeper plot line of AI, its connection to the Asian War itself, all the people that kind of worked in the background in order to orchestrate this, getting into the endless cycle of revenge itself, hatred, the emotions of humanity, and additionally, the evolution of AI. Over time, Geshik will end up meeting all the different specialized robots that were involved in the war itself, including Adam, who tried to push for peace, Epsilon, who pretty much kept out of the war itself. All the while, Geshik himself is sort of dealing with his own inner conflicts. He's dealing with a lot of nightmares, and it seems like there's something like a ghost or a missing gap within his own mind. So my thoughts on Pluto. My gosh, this show is kind of a mixed bag for me. Honestly, when I started watching this show, getting into the first 4 episodes, besides certain stories like North 2, which was this whole story about one of the specialized robots becoming a butler for this guy that is a pianist that's living in his remote mansion. I absolutely love that story because it was getting into the concept of somebody, an old fart that doesn't trust robots, doesn't like the idea of robots creating music and how they essentially repeat what they're told. They have no emotions. They couldn't understand emotion of mankind itself. It's kind of like an old man yelling at the clouds as AI is kind of functioning everything around him. It was a really nice little story there because it is sort of giving us a really clear picture of this idea of mankind themselves not really wanting to believe that a robot, a machine, can have anything of a semblance of humanity within them. No emotions, nothing. It's sort of tapping into that idea of discrimination between mankind and robots, despite the fact that it seems like the world as a whole is accepting this idea of the rights of robots and them sort of living side by side. This is one of those worlds where if you're walking down the road with your family, you're holding hands with your wife and your son, and you're walking down the street, you'll cross paths with 2 robots that are holding the hand of a child robot. It's just a normality in this world. AI has gotten that advanced that they have that sense there. But something that is always kept there is this idea that robots cannot have emotions. And some would argue that it requires emotion to create music. And yes, that a lot of people would believe that a robot would not be able to create something of its own. They would only mimic other things. So there's a lot of conflict between this pianist and this robot. And yes, getting into the idea slowly but surely that this robot, amongst all the other specialized robots that we're going to kind of slowly over time see, are all dealing with the scars of the war itself. Which again, doesn't really make sense. Why would you have this massive war that robots were involved with and have any feeling that there would be this sense of PTSD and the trauma that came from that war itself? It seems very evident as we meet every single one of these individuals that this is something that impacts them somehow, which again, based on our knowledge of robots, shouldn't be a thing. But with the concept of AI itself, it makes sense that these things can slowly learn things, possibly even emotions. But despite my enjoyment of that story of North 2 and this pianist, after that, I didn't really feel like I was getting much out of the show, which is harsh to say because, again, this is technically the length of 10 episodes that I'm talking about. This little gap here that I didn't feel like enough was happening. I felt like it was a lot of just introducing different characters, introducing concepts of, robots having emotions and the concept of hatred itself, all kind of just building up this idea of here's the next specialized robot that this bad guy is going to go after, and will they kill them or not? Okay, here's the next specialized robot. Will the bad guy go and kill them next? Okay, it felt sort of repetitive in a sense. But then, past that second half, I would probably say more towards the 6th episode of the 8 episodes, that's when things really started to ramp up for me. That's where I felt like a lot of the plot lines and everything started finally coming together. It finally started to try to twist and turn the storylines and started to make me really feel excited for what was going to come next. The earlier half of the show just felt very safe with the story that it was telling. It didn't feel like it was trying to pull me in a direction that I wasn't anticipating already. But those later parts is where it's starting to get in the crux of what I think the story was really going for, and that is really diving into these robots, diving into the concepts of AI, diving into the PTSD, a semblance of creation of emotions, or at least the mimicking of emotions that humans are facing, that struggle whether or not those emotions are valid or not. Which makes perfect sense, again, in the idea of AI copying the semblance of humanity itself, personalities, that you would possibly create the concept of that. And I think how they executed all that kind of stuff was really solid. There was several gut punches towards the later part of this series that I wasn't really getting in the first half. Again, this isn't a show that's really trying to hold much back. This is a lot of trauma. This is a lot of difficulties these characters are facing. And yes, a lot of suffering. But I wasn't feeling it. It almost felt very episodic cartoonish in a way, even though they're very long episodes. The second half is where it starts to kind of nail those personalities. It starts to get me involved with the characters, and maybe it just took me half a show to really get involved with those characters. That's where things started to really hit. That's where the impact of every single twist and turn was actually happening for me. At its core, Geshik is an incredible character. Early on, I didn't really feel it too much, and I think that's partially because of the fact that, yes, he's a robot. It's hard to get a sense of emotion and a connection to somebody that is technically a robot. He technically does have the appearance of a human, but at the same time, he doesn't seem to show much emotion at all. He kind of just ends up being the storyteller throughout the entire series, without ever really having any sort of hook to me personally. I think it wasn't until he really started getting involved with Adam that I think I started becoming very intrigued by him. And yes, that's mostly because Adam at some point just kind of mentions, hey, something I've seen in there doesn't look right, and that started to bring up massive question marks as to who Geshik is, which I think technically plays into what I was mentioning earlier in this idea that this show's for the first half doesn't really seem to want to get its claws in me. And it wasn't really until those later parts where those reveals start to happen, where you start to kind of deep dive into characters like Geshik, where you start having things happen to characters that you have involvement with at that point, that things start to twist in an interesting way. Now, I won't say that the second half of the series is phenomenal. There is one aspect of Pluto as a whole that really does come out there and start to bite at your face when you're getting in that second half area. You'll probably notice it in the first half. It's just that's where it starts to really pick up. This series, and it's partly to do, I think, with the fact that it's based off of Astro Boy, is very preachy. This show wants to tell you what you should think about hatred and revenge and war and suffering and PTSD and the effects of revenge and the effects of war itself. It just wants to tell you that, and it is going to slap the book in your face over and over again until you get it. It is a very preachy series. Not to say that it takes away from the overall story, but it is something that gets a bit heavy at times. Me personally, it didn't bug me. It felt obvious, but I do think there's probably going to be a lot of people out there that are going to probably find this to be a little bit too much. One other issue that I unfortunately had with the series, I feel like it jumps around a bit too much. There was times where I'm trying to really get a gauge on what's happening over here, but for some reason it decides to jump over to another character and start talking about a story over there. In most cases, the story is interlinked between each different character they're jumping perspectives to, but a lot of the time it just feels like they're building up the story over here, but then they'll jump over here and they'll start a different story. And I found myself kind of frustrated that they didn't want to kind of stick the landing for these stories rather than keep jumping around. That said, I do find a lot of these individual stories really fantastic. Again, unfortunately for a lot of the stories like Brando, Heracles, unfortunately, there's a lot of stories in here where I just didn't really care. They almost felt like they were too forced. And again, a lot of that kind of comes around the idea of forcing that let's go to each one of these specialized robots and see if they're going to survive or not. But whenever it kind of got into the deeper subjects of things like Uran and the person that she meets, North 2 and Paul Duncan, even all the interesting things they did with Adam himself were really fascinating. And again, Geschicht, I think his story was absolutely incredible. It sort of is a slow burn series, which is hard to say when it's technically 20 episodes of length. A series that you kind of have to get built into it, understand the baseline of the world itself, the concept of the robots, the concepts of emotions, the concepts of the AI, and if they can actually produce the concept of emotions. How humanity themselves see robots and how they should act. And yes, ultimately, the scars of the war itself. As you get that understanding of those concepts, that's when it really starts to hit in the later half. Visually, the show is absolutely fantastic. I think the director, which surprisingly enough is very new to doing directing work, did a really incredible job for this show, despite the fact that they seem like they're fairly new. I mean, they were an animation director, and so you can get a lot of sense of being able to kind of mold and shape the series in a very artistic way from that experience. But yeah, a very fresh new main director jumping out of the gate with something like Pluto is really incredible. Now, yes, I will admit I am not a bit, and I expected it based on the fact of the PVs themselves. There is a lot of use of CGI in this show, and it's mostly for environmental and for objects themselves, not so much for the characters. I like that they kept the characters themselves in 2D. But there was a lot of very odd choices of using CGI, like, for instance, with Geschicht, when he uses his weapon. It seems for some reason they're using some sort of CGI for his cannon, or at least they're putting some sort of bizarre filter over it that just doesn't look right. And they did similar things with filters later on, especially like with Adam in this one fight. For some reason, they decided to put this weird gloss effect around his outside. Like they were trying to put some sort of filter around him, like a filter that would find in a basic Photoshop filter. It's just like this weird kind of almost sketch outline that kind of blurs the outline of the character themselves that just didn't really fit. Plus things like the tornado itself that you'll see throughout the series, for some reason, that was full CGI, which I kind of understand because animating a tornado these days is probably a no-go for a lot of animators for some reason. But outside of that, everything else looked fantastic. And again, I would give a lot of credit to the directing work that was done for this series because it's just kind of one of those series that doesn't seem to want to stay in one place and in a boring perspective ever. It's just the perspective shots and everything just constantly change. So overall, very beautiful series. A lot of really gorgeous shots, very atmospheric in a lot of cases. Very simple scenes where characters are kind of just standing and you're getting a little bit of motion in there are just done in a way that's very beautiful. In the end, it was a fantastic series. I really enjoyed it. I wish it picked up quicker. And it's definitely an interesting kind of introduction to, yes, the creator of Monster, which I have not watched Monster yet. Thankfully, it is a full adaptation, so you don't have to worry about if Netflix will ever do a second season. I checked the manga, and sure enough, the very end is in the last episode itself. But I do have to admit that I kind of wish there was more because there is two things that are kind of vague about the ending. There's two very specific characters that they sprinkle throughout the series and then have sort of be a integral part of the very ending that doesn't necessarily have any sort of sign of origins. I mean, you could draw your conclusions as to why they're there, but at the same time, it just felt like they just popped up out of nowhere and then they're gone. But again, it's kind of one of those things that doesn't necessarily make me go, oh my gosh, I hated that ending because of that. No, it's just kind of one of those, okay, you're there still, I guess. But anyways, happy ending, question mark? It's like, just kind of move on. But yeah, there was a lot of really fantastic moments in the series that, honestly, over time, I might want to come back and revisit at some point. I love the stuff they did with Adam. I love the stuff that they did with Uran and a particular individual. Again, Geschicht was a really fantastic character. Shoot, I even really liked Brau, 1589. Brau, he's like the first robot that ever killed a human because in this world, robots are programmed to not be able to harm humans, but Brau was the first case ever that a robot has ever killed a human, and so they were pretty much impaled and locked up somewhere, which again, I think he's supposed to be based off of a character in Astro Boy. He was just kind of a twisted character, very interesting twisted character. My last thing I want to mention, and this might be a hot take, so get ready for it. This is not a good action show. I have to admit, this show is not a good action show. And I don't know if that's intentional to the theme of the series itself, is this idea that, again, hatred's bad, war bad, violence bad. I think that there is an essence here of anti-war, anti-violence. And I think that's possibly why, while yes, the action scenes look good, there's not much there. There's not much meat to it itself. And even later on, it gets to a point where it kind of turns into the whole lights flying across the sky because they're so powerful kind of thing. There is not much to really dig into here. A lot of the key pivotal action scenes that you would assume is going to happen are all kind of, let's just say, clouded. You're not seeing much. And that's kind of the difficulty when you build up a lot with a lot of these action scenes and nothing really is shown, or what's shown is very, very subtle, which again is sort of surprising because what we see in the PV was a lot of really cool scenes of Geshik walking around, running around and shooting stuff. And it seemed like this was a high action series. It's not, which, keep in mind, is not technically a bad thing. It's like there's more focus on the characters themselves and the story that it's telling. It's a very character-centric and story-driven type of show. This isn't, again, driven by just the sheer sake of seeing who's going to fight next, when's the next battle, who's Adam going to beat up next, is North 2 going to win, that kind of stuff. It is really kind of centered around the mystery and what Geshik, the mystery that he's trying to solve, and how all these characters are interconnected in some way. But again, that might be a hot take for me. But yeah, that's all to say. Really fantastic series. If you have spare 2 cores worth of length of spare time in order to jump into the series, definitely check it out. It's definitely worth a watch. Probably one of those series that you can probably just make a couple weeks out of it. Just watch an episode every night, turn it off, watch it the next day kind of thing. It's just a really nice little watch, and it does technically have a theatrical feel to it with the production qualities that was technically put into it. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Pluto. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, make sure to hit that like button down below, comment, let me know what you think of the series if you're going to be checking it out. Additionally, if you're new to the channel, make sure that subscribe button to get my content. I do news, reviews, first impressions, top list. If it's anime, it's pretty much here. Additionally, if you want to support the channel more and you like this content, I have a Patreon link, tips link, super thanks, membership button down below. Greatly appreciate everybody it does. Y'all take care.